it up. Now we're going to clean off the top of the CPU. And I'm actually just scraping off with my fingernail some of the hardened residue that's on the top of the CPU. A lot of times an overheating CPU can fry a motherboard, and that might be the problem. So we want to make sure that it's okay, and you have a good, strong, heat bond between the heat sink and the CPU itself. And I'm using a paper towel there just to clean off the big chunks, and then I'll hit it with that toothbrush and just get all the little pieces and the fine pieces out of the way. You don't want any of that stuff floating around on top of the motherboard until we get a nice clean connection on there. Hit it with some compressed air. And I want to take the heat sink and the CPU fan outside and hit it with a blast of compressed air before we do anything else. It's another good idea to when you have the fan and you have the CPU out of the computer, clean it then. This way you get all the dust out, and you're not pushing the dust all inside the case and all over the motherboard. You got a clean environment here, so you might as well take advantage of it. Now we're going to take some thermal grease and put a little dab of it on the processor. You don't want to put too much. I'm using Arctic Silver thermal grease. This is actually the ceramic version, but they make silver version as well. I believe the silver is better quality, but this should be just fine. I'm just making sure the cap is securely back on there so it doesn't spill out in the drawer. And then I take a piece of Scotch tape, and this is the best way I've found to do this. A piece of Scotch tape, I put it over my finger long ways. And I kind of paint the processor with the grease on the Scotch tape, then throw the Scotch tape out. This way I don't get it all over my finger. Just to make it more of an even coat. I guess I got a little on my finger, but... And I'm just cleaning up around the edges. I like to be a little neat when I put the grease on the processor. Now we're going to take the heatsink and fan and put it back on. It's a common thing to forget to attach the fan to the motherboard, the wire, the power for the fan to the motherboard. So I always like to do that first, just in case I forget, because you don't want that to happen where the fan is not connected. And then I like to do this in a crisscross pattern, screwing the heatsink back onto the processor. Because I don't like to put, if you just take one side and screw it all the way down, I feel like it puts too much pressure, and you want a nice even pressure put on the processor. You don't want it to get messed up anyhow. Just like putting a tire on and taking a tire off, that's how I attach these screws. And I don't over tighten, just nice and snug. Now it's time to put the motherboard back into the bottom case. There's still a little dust there in the heatsink. So, like I said before, since you have the motherboard out and the fan out, heatsink out, clean it up while you can. I'm just using a toothbrush to get in between the fins there. Especially if it's a smoker's computer, it gets real sticky in there, so you might have to use something like a toothbrush. Sorry, it's out of frame a little bit there. I'm actually going to take the vacuum as well with the brush attachment like we used earlier and use that to get the rest of the stuff out of the heatsink. Just want to make a nice clean, way for the air to pass through. Okay, we're back now. The heatsink is clean. It's time to put the motherboard back into the computer. Just make sure you have it lined up properly. It only goes in one way. And I'm going to attach these cables first, which is the power. It actually goes to the circuit board where the power adapter plugs into. And then this other cable, which I believe is for that USB port and maybe the Ethernet port that's on that separate circuit board as well. Maybe not the Ethernet, I think it's just the USB. And as I put pieces back together, I like to just clean them up. Take a paintbrush, clean paintbrush, preferably one that's never been used with paint, and just dust everything off. Now we're going to flip this around. We're probably going to put it in at an angle, which is usually how the motherboards kind of go in. They put them in at an angle and then lay them down flat once the angle is achieved. And that's not quite in, so let's see if we can push it down and snap it in. Okay, all the connectors look like they're in. Now we're just going to try to lay the other part flush. If the motherboard's not laying flush like it was when you first took it out, then check for connectors under the motherboard that's holding it in. And there was a little cable stuck under there that was causing it not to lay flush. I'm taking a little bit of time here because it still doesn't seem like it's seating in properly. And you don't want it to arch up at all because then you know something's wrong. And then when you screw everything back together, you could actually be damaging the motherboard. And once you're confident everything's lined up, you can start putting the screws back in. Right now I'm looking at the connectors through the holes in the side, making sure they're in properly and completely lined up. It still seems like there's something under there causing a problem. Okay, and it looks like we got everything laid flush now, so we're going to put the pieces back. Starting with the remote controller holder.